It was the hottest hour of the day, and that was precisely why I chose to walk. No one sane went to the well at noon. The streets were empty, doors closed, conversations hidden behind shade. At that hour, no one had to pretend kindness. No one had to lower their voice when I passed. I believed the heat would be the hardest thing I would face that day. I was wrong. Loneliness does not arrive in a single moment. It settles slowly, in glances that linger too long and greetings that never come. By then, I had memorized the rhythm of avoidance. I knew which hours belonged to the women who gathered in the morning light, and which hour belonged to me. Noon was mine, harsh, exposed, unforgiving, but at least it was honest. And honesty, even when it burns, is easier than quiet rejection. I preferred the silence of the road to the noise of their thoughts. Silence never rehearsed my failures or reshaped my story into something sharper. It simply existed beside me. The dust lifted gently with each step, clinging to my sandals, as if even the earth refused to let go. I told myself I was invisible at that hour. I told myself the well would be empty. I did not expect to be seen. Our town was small enough that nothing stayed buried for long. Stories traveled faster than trade, carried from doorway to doorway until they no longer resembled the truth. I had become one of those stories. Not a woman, but a version of one. You learn, after a while, to hear your own name spoken like a warning. So I stopped listening. I walked at noon because the sun does not gossip. There are choices you make, and then there are labels others attach to them. I had made mine. They had made theirs. Over time, the two became impossible to separate. I carried water the way I carried memory, carefully balanced, careful not to spill. Shame is not loud. It does not shout in the marketplace. It waits quietly and walks beside you, reminding you that everyone else remembers. By noon, most people rested. I walked. The heat pressed against my skin, but it was cleaner than their curiosity. I told myself I preferred it this way, that solitude was strength. The truth was simpler. I was tired of being measured by eyes that had already decided who I was. So I chose the hour when shadows were shortest and judgment stayed indoors. That day felt no different, until I saw him. At first I thought I was mistaken. Travelers rarely stopped there at that hour. The well was a meeting place in the cool of morning, not beneath a merciless sun. But he was there, seated near the stone edge, as if he had been waiting longer than I had been walking. I slowed without meaning to. Something in me wanted to turn back. Something else refused to. He did not look like danger. That surprised me. Men who travel alone often carry something sharp in their eyes. He carried weariness instead. Dust on his feet, shoulders slightly lowered. A Jewish man, clearly, which meant distance was expected between us. History had drawn its lines long before either of us were born. I told myself I would draw water quickly and leave without a word. I kept my eyes lowered as I approached, but I could feel his presence the way you feel shade before stepping into it. The well stood between us, old and silent, as if it had seen encounters like this before. My hands tightened around the jar. If I moved carefully enough, perhaps I could pass through the moment unnoticed. I had mastered the art of being almost invisible. I began lowering the jar, focusing on the sound of rope against stone, pretending that the world had narrowed to that single task. Then he spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to reach me without forcing it. "Give me a drink." The words were simple, but they broke something in the air between us. Men did not ask me for things with kindness. They assumed, they dismissed. They did not request. For a moment, I wondered if I had heard him correctly. A Jewish man asking a Samaritan woman for water was not a small thing. It crossed lines that most people guarded fiercely. I looked up, expecting mockery or hidden insult. I found neither. His expression held no superiority, no hesitation, just a quiet expectancy, as though my answer mattered. That unsettled me more than rejection ever had. I answered the only way I knew how, with distance. "You are a Jew," I said, letting the weight of history rest between us. "And I am a Samaritan woman." The sentence carried centuries of resentment, suspicion, and carefully protected pride. It should have ended everything. It was the kind of truth people used to close doors. I expected him to withdraw, to remember the rules we both understood. But he did not step back. Instead, he spoke of something I did not expect. "If you knew the gift of God," he said, "you would have asked me for living water." Living water. The phrase sounded strange in the heat of that afternoon. I glanced at the well, deep and ordinary. There was no river nearby, no hidden spring. I assumed he was speaking in riddles, the way teachers often do. I remember feeling a flicker of irritation. The well was deep, and he had nothing with which to draw. No rope, no jar, no visible means to offer anything at all. "Where will you get this living water?" I asked, almost daring him to answer. We both knew the weight of that well. Generations had lowered their thirst into its darkness. It was not easily impressed by bold claims. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He spoke as if thirst was more than dry lips and cracked skin, as if the deeper hunger in a person could not be filled by a jar lowered into stone. "Whoever drinks this water will thirst again," he said gently, "but the water I give will become a spring within." Something in his tone made the words feel less like poetry and more like promise. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. A spring within. I had spent years walking back and forth to that well, measuring my days in empty jars and heavy returns. If there were a way to stop coming, to stop repeating the same tired path, I wanted it. "Sir," I said, half curious, half guarded, "give me this water." Even then, I did not understand what I was asking. He looked at me then, not past me, not through me, but at me. "Go," he said quietly. "Call your husband and come back." The words landed gently, yet they carried weight. My breath caught before I could control it. The heat no longer felt like the strongest thing in that moment. There are questions that expose more than they ask. I knew this was one of them. "I have no husband," I replied. It was the simplest answer, the safest version of the truth. I had learned to keep explanations short. Fewer details meant fewer judgments. For a heartbeat, I wondered if he would let it rest there. Most men would have. Most would not care enough to look further. But he did not move away from the silence that followed my words. "You are right," he said, and there was no accusation in his voice. "You have had 5 husbands, and the man you are with now is not your husband." He spoke the truth as if it were light, not a weapon. Each word settled over me, not to crush, but to uncover. No stranger should have known those details. No traveler passing through should have seen that far. I felt exposed in a way I had never felt before, not because he knew, but because he knew and did not turn away. There was no smirk, no satisfaction in being correct, only clarity. It is one thing to be judged for your story. It is another to have it fully seen and still be spoken to with gentleness. In that moment, I did not feel condemned. I felt known. Something inside me shifted. The well, the sun, the town behind me, all of it seemed smaller than the space between his words. I tried to regain control of the moment, to move the conversation somewhere safer. "Sir," I said, "I see that you are a prophet." It was easier to speak of religion than of myself. Easier to debate worship than to stand fully exposed. "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain," I continued, gesturing toward the familiar ridge in the distance. "But you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. It was an old argument, well rehearsed, safely impersonal. If we spoke about sacred locations, we would not have to speak about sacred wounds. I expected him to defend his side, to correct me, to draw another line. But he did not argue about mountains or temples. He spoke of a time coming when worship would not be bound to stone or city. True worshippers will worship in spirit and in truth, he said. The words were unfamiliar, yet they felt strangely near, as if he were describing something that could happen anywhere. Even here, even now, even to someone like me. I had heard promises before, men promising change, leaders promising freedom. None of it lasted, so I reached for something safer, something future and distant. I know that the Messiah is coming, I said. When he comes, he will explain everything. It was easier to postpone hope than to risk believing it stood in front of me. Hope can be dangerous when you have learned to expect disappointment. He did not hesitate. He did not lower his voice as if sharing a secret. I, who speak to you, am he. The words were steady, almost simple, yet they carried a weight that made the air feel thinner. I had spoken of the Messiah as a distant figure, someone who would one day resolve every question. Now that promise stood before me, asking for water. For a moment, the world felt suspended. The well, the sun, the boundaries we had named all of it, faded behind those words. I searched his face for exaggeration, for pride, for anything that would allow me to dismiss him. I found none, only certainty, not loud certainty, but grounded, unshaken. It frightened me more than doubt ever could. In that stillness, I realized something I had not expected. He had spoken of my past without contempt. He had spoken of worship without argument. And now he spoke of himself without spectacle. No crowd, no raised hands. Just a tired traveler at a well, telling a woman like me that the waiting was over. If he was wrong, he was the calmest liar I had ever seen. I looked down at the jar in my hands. I had come for water, for something ordinary and measurable. But suddenly the jar felt small, almost irrelevant. My thirst had never been only physical. It had been the quiet ache of being unseen, unheard, misunderstood. And here stood a man who had seen all of it and had not stepped away. That realization unsettled me more than any accusation could have. I do not remember deciding to believe him. I only remember the way hope rose in me before permission could stop it. It was cautious at first, like light entering a room that has been closed too long. Part of me resisted. Another part leaned forward. If he truly was who he claimed to be, then everything I thought I understood about myself was incomplete. Voices approached in the distances, companions returning from the town. I sensed the moment shifting again, becoming something public, something fragile. I had spent years shrinking under public eyes, yet now I felt an urgency I could not contain. If what he said was true, it could not remain only mine. The jar slipped from my priorities. Water suddenly felt secondary to what had just been spoken. I left the jar behind. Even now, that detail surprises me. I had carried it every day, guarding it like necessity itself. But in that moment, it no longer defined why I had come. I turned toward the town I had avoided for so long. The same streets, the same doors. Only this time, I was not trying to pass unnoticed. As I walked back, the heat no longer felt like punishment. It felt like urgency. My steps were faster, almost reckless. These were the same people who had measured me, whispered about me, reduced me to a cautionary tale. Yet I found myself searching for their faces. I did not have every answer. I did not understand every word he had spoken. But I knew this. I had met someone who knew me completely. I entered the town without lowering my eyes. That alone would have startled them. I began speaking before doubt could silence me. Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. The words sounded impossible, even as I said them. Yet they were not heavy with shame. They were alive with wonder. For once, my story was not a warning. It was an invitation. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with curiosity. They had heard my voice before, but never like this. I was not defending myself. I was not explaining. I was urging. Could this be the Messiah? I asked, not as someone who had mastered certainty, but as someone who had tasted it. The question hung in the air, unsettling the same streets that once unsettled me. They followed me back to the well. The same path I had walked to avoid them now carried us together. I watched their expressions shift as they approached him. Curiosity softened into attention. Doubt wrestled with recognition. I stood slightly behind, no longer the center of the story. And for the first time in years, that did not wound me. I had brought them to him. That was enough. They listened to him for themselves. That mattered. Faith borrowed from another never lasts. I watched as their guarded expressions slowly opened, as if something within them recognized a voice older than their doubts. Some returned to the town changed before the sun had lowered. I remained near the edge, aware that what had begun at noon was now spreading beyond me. Later, many of them said they believed not only because of my words, but because they had heard him themselves. I did not feel diminished by that. If anything, I felt relieved. My role had never been to convince, only to testify. I had carried water for years. That day, I carried a message. And unlike the jar I left behind, this weight felt light. When the day finally cooled and shadows began to stretch again, I found myself thinking about the hour I once feared. Noon had been my hiding place. Now it had become the place where I was found. The well had not changed. The town had not moved. But I had. Something within me had shifted from concealment to clarity. I was no longer walking to avoid being seen. Years have passed since that afternoon, yet I remember the light more than the heat. I remember the way his voice carried neither accusation nor flattery. He saw the parts of me I had tried to outrun, and he did not step away. That is what stayed with me. Not the argument about mountains, not the shock of his claim, but the quiet certainty of being fully known. I went to the well that day to avoid everyone. I thought I was choosing the safest hour, the emptiest road, the quietest space. Instead, I stepped into the moment that changed the course of my life. I arrived carrying water and shame. I left carrying witness and hope. I did not understand everything then. I still do not understand everything now. But I know this: I was there.